Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very cold day. We appreciate that you're making time to learn more about youth justice research. If you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. On that note, I will do the same. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. I want to express my thanks to all of our partners in New York State, especially the Division of Criminal Justice Services and the University at Albany. Without their support, we wouldn't be here. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to be the first to welcome today's speakers, Dr. Hsieh and Dr. Heinze. Thank you both so much for being here. I cannot wait to learn from you. Joining us in this virtual space is Dr. Alicia May, our project manager here at the YJI, and whose area of expertise is very much in line with today's presentation. So she will be facilitating the conversation and moderating the questions. Alicia, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. It is also my pleasure here today to welcome our speakers, Dr. Hsing-Fang Hsieh and Dr. Justin Heinze, both from the University of Michigan. Their full bios have been dropped in the chat, so feel free to take a look there. Today, they will be leading a discussion on their randomized control trials studies evaluating the effectiveness of the Say Something Anonymous Reporting System, or SS-ARS, in a presentation titled, "If They See Something, Do They Say Something?" We encourage everybody who is here with us today to drop your questions into the Q&A portion throughout the entire presentation for the conversation portion of our webinar. So without further ado, Dr. Hsieh, Dr. Heinze, thank you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate the introduction. Nice to see everyone. I hope you're having a great day. We can go to the next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide?
I'm sorry. Are you all seeing the next slide? No, obviously not, huh?
Okay. Okay, great. All right.
Is it okay to try to reshare again? Sorry. How about let's.
All right. Sounds great. All right. This is what we're thinking about today as we talk about these reporting systems. So we're going to start with sort of a landscape of what anonymous reporting systems or tip lines are, particularly school-based tip lines. Then we're also going to get into a specific study that we ran in the state of Florida to look at the effects of an anonymous reporting system on school climate. But then also, I think importantly, we're going to look at some of the implementation of that anonymous reporting system and how that was received by staff in the building. And then at the end, we want to talk about how anonymous reporting systems are not a panacea, but they're going to be part of a broader, more comprehensive approach to school safety. So they're one component that we think can be important and effective, but not going to be the end all be all. Next slide, please. All right, we are going to start with just to get a feel for how many folks have been involved with a school-based, I'm going to say school-based tip line or reporting system. Could be anonymous reporting system, could be confidential reporting system, could be another form for students to be able to express concerns. But we're not talking about like a 988 or a national line here, but something that is kind of specific to a school. Seeing some numbers come in. And thank you for that. I mean, it sounds like this is might be new for some, or at least there's not a direct involvement. I think one of the interesting things about anonymous or confidential reporting systems is they do sort of take a village. And so even if your role is adjacent or tangential to a school, knowing about these systems, I think, can be important for your work. So what is an anonymous reporting system? And again, we're going to focus specifically on anonymous reporting systems, but there are multiple ways that we can think about what reporting systems are. They build off of the Department of Homeland Security See Something, Say Something model. So anybody who's been on an airplane or on a bus or on a metro has probably seen that message or heard that message. If you see something, say something. These sort of lateral surveillance interventions are designed to get people to recognize things and report them to the proper authorities so that then they can address the problem. They are newer to schools, although Colorado started to do this in the early 2000s. There was a period where there was just a couple systems online, but over the last 10 years, they've really proliferated, such that we are seeing them in over 50% of schools. And so students have access to these systems through multiple ways, whether it's through their phone, email, whichever it might be. But the basic model here is down at the bottom. We're hoping that students are educated about these systems. They know what to look out for. They see it, whether it's online, they hear it in person, it's something that they heard from a third party. They report it to this system. The system triages that information, so they try to get as much as they can, figure out what's going on, and then they're going to send that to either a school professional, a mental health or medical professional, or perhaps law enforcement, depending on the kind of tip that they're seeing. And what we're going to get to a little bit later on is I think there are gaps in our understanding at each phase of this process. How we're thinking about what they see and hear and report, what their reporting structure actually looks like, and how those reports are handled, and then how are we responding to them. So there's a lot of work that's just starting to get off the ground, which we think is important because, again, these tip lines are becoming ubiquitous. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about a specific tip line, the Say Something Anonymous reporting system. So this is important, I think, for me to get across. We don't advocate for a specific system or a vendor or even the process for how these systems are used. This happens to be the one that we were studying because of a long-standing partnership that we had with the Sandy Hook Promise Foundation. But I think the questions that sort of engendered the research that we're doing with Sandy Hook Promise probably are appropriate for other systems as well, because sometimes systems are district specific. So you might have a system that a district develops on their own or with maybe federal funding, and they're creating their own tip line. And so I think you're going to run into some of the same things as some of these national providers like Say Something Anonymous reporting system, like Stop It. But the essentials are pretty much the same. Try to get students to recognize the concern, make the report, triage the report, and then ultimately find the resolution. The Say Something Anonymous reporting system has been around for about 7 years, I think. They've been able to train over 5 million students, reaching over 150,000 of those. And you can see them across how they're operating across the United States. I will say that now up to 34 states have their own specific tip line. So the state of Michigan, state of Florida, state of Ohio, they all have a tip line that was either housed in it could be their state police office, it could be their Department of Education. But again, these systems are becoming more and more common. And so now it's trying to understand, are students using them and how are they using them? Next slide, please. And we have tried to do some of this in a systematic way. We don't want to just create this. This is not a, if you build it, they will come sort of model. We want to make sure that once that infrastructure is in place, do we know whether students are using it and doing it in such a way that we're ultimately preventing violence against themselves or others? And our research team has tried to do a little bit. In this report here, we did a synthesis of the literature that's out there around this topic that included academic papers, but also some of the gray literature. So these would be reports that you find or things that we're seeing online. And there just hasn't been a lot of work done to date on these systems. Next slide, please. We've done a little bit through this study that we're going to talk about in just a second in Florida. I will say that that Research Triangle International and Michael Planty had an NIJ-funded report that did a great job of trying to also sort of create a landscape around whether how many systems there are, who tends to run these systems, how they're being used. There are also out of Safe to Tell Nevada, Al Stein-Sawasi led a study to see whether or not that system was able to procure reports, how they were handled, gave us a good understanding of the types of tips that students were using. There's been a little bit of work out of the group from Colorado looking at Safe to Tell. And one of the things that really did come out of this work really explicitly is that even though these systems were designed originally to prevent school shootings or mass school violence, students are using them in a lot of different ways. They're reporting mental health concerns. They're reporting bullying concerns. They're reporting substance use. So you could be surprised at the number of different types of tips that are coming in, which again is great. We want to have this information, but we also want to make sure those that are receiving those tips are trained and ready to respond to them, because how you might respond to a student who is experiencing suicidal ideation could be very different from one that is reporting, a concern, or that they saw somebody thinking about bringing a gun to school, which is in turn different saying that they saw an adult act inappropriately at a sporting event or something like that. So how these systems are negotiating our evolving understanding of these tip lines and how students are using them is very important. So we've done, again, a little bit of work on this in this space, but I think there's a lot more that can and will be done in the near future as people begin to recognize how they are operating. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor about how Sandy Hook Promise approaches their own anonymous reporting system, you can see this is some of the paraphernalia that they use. A big part of their approach is to just create that awareness. Again, you can create this tool and have apps available and have phone lines available, email addresses, whatever it might be, but if students don't know about it, and in particular, our sort of public health theory talks about this, if you're not confident in your own ability to recognize and report something, you very well might not. So we're thinking about the behavioral intentions around why and how students are making the decision to report. Next step, please, or next slide. And this is one of the things that we did. We tried to put this into a conceptual model. We think it's important to think mechanistically about how students are and staff and the whole school community, and honestly, are using these systems. So for the researchers on the call, on the left-hand side, we have our intervention. The assumption is do you implement the Say Something program by helping students recognize threats, learn how to respond appropriately, and you're trying to engage them with this system. You make the system available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. If you can implement that with fidelity, let's not forget about that piece, like as intended, we should see changes in both students and staff. So behavioral changes in terms of their actual reporting, attitudes around whether I think it's a good idea to report or am I actually snitching on people. This is something that we have to overcome. Again, self-advocacy and relationships that would hopefully create an environment where folks feel comfortable. And that's why we have this positive school climate circle. We do not think that if a school feels like there is a lack of trust, that adults don't care about students, that it might be unsafe to report, they are actually going to make those reports. We think students are going to refrain from doing that. And so in order to really get to that far right-hand side, those violent outcomes, we want to make sure that we're promoting that positive school climate. Again, building social relationships, building trust, helping students with their conflict resolution, all of those things that kind of fall within what we think of as school climate, which can be pretty broad. So now we're going to talk about whether or not this conceptual model panned out when we actually got to go down and collect some data to see how students are using the system.
Thanks, Justin. And I think I would just take over here. Hi, everyone. It's Hsing-Fang Hsieh. So as Justin mentioned, that our research team have been doing this work for a while. And this is actually the first randomized control trial that we got funded by NIJ, the federal funding, to really conduct the study with 30 schools initially, and then break down the 2 cohort to look at whether this programming is making a difference for the students' behavior intention and also the school climate based on the conceptual model you guys just saw. So we're really honored to be able to collaborate with the Miami-Dade County Public Schools to recruit these number of schools to participate in the study. What I'm gonna focus on talking about today is the cohort 1 of the school, the 90 middle schools. And the reason I want to focus on this is that this is the cohort where we're able to collect up to 2 years of the study period for the data from the students. And so it allows us to really look into not only the short-term outcome, but also the long-term outcome up to 2 years, how the changes may have been. And so within these 19 schools, we have 8 of them are what we call treatment, and the other are control schools. We collect baseline data as well as 3-time follow-up at 3 months, 9 months, and 2 years. We also collect some implementation data like fidelity for the Say Something anonymous reporting system. So with the cohort 1 study, again, we're able to recruit more than 700 sixth graders across these 19 schools and really ask them these questions we care about. And this very first slide of the outcome we're seeing here are I want to emphasize the 2 most important behavior change indicators. That is theory-based. One is the intention to report or to perform certain behavior. The other is what we call self-efficacy. Essentially, that's just how confident an individual feel when they're able to perform a specific behavior in a specific scenario. So our questions are really geared toward this construct called self-efficacy, really specific on, okay, if you were to recognize the warning sign, would you feel confident to report it through the anonymous reporting system or through the other public channels like trusted adults, teachers, or law enforcement? So we have a bunch of questions asking that. And so in our analysis, I just want to put it out there. This is one of the most significant findings we have, is that in the treatment schools, the students' confidence, their self-efficacy and intention to report increased by almost 50%. Compared to control schools. And the control schools for these intention and self-efficacy, they oftentimes stay stable, or in some schools, they have a decreased. And this is something kind of fun effect you'll find is that over time, when students spend more time in school, both of their reporting behavior and their perception of school tend to drop over time. So this is why the treatment is the program is making such a difference, is that for students who actually receive these programming, we see a significant increase of improvement of these intention and self-efficacy. Now, the other thing we really care about, as Justine just mentioned, is the school climate indicators, how students perceive about their school, and also what they see about the change in school violence. And what we saw, again, is the improved school safety amongst the treatment schools and the improved school connectedness, meaning that how they feel close to the people at school and how they feel trusted by the people at school. So those are significant improvement amongst programming schools compared to the control schools. And finally, I think the last one is something we recognize is the decreased school violence that were reported by the school students. So we found on average a 13% decrease from baseline amongst the treatment school students reporting of the school violence. And then we also find that the school violence tend to drop in the treatment school, while the control school have a stable or increase of the school violence experience. So these are the key findings we found so far. We also were wondering, okay, what we learned from the students and the school personnel when they're implementing, let's say, something anonymous reporting system. What kind of implementation factors may matter in terms of this programming success? So again, we try to look at the data. This is the data we collected from the Syndicate Promise Foundation. We work with them to keep records on how school implement the activities. We also ask Miami-Dade Public School personnel how they are implementing that. So these are, on the left-hand side, are the key indicators we think may be important for the implementation activity. And I want you to lay your eye on the 2 specific indicators here, because we think that matches with our theory. One is the student engagement component, the Safe Promise Club. In the Safe Promise Club, it's a student-led club in the schools, in that specific school, that's specifically running the campaign for the Safe Sounding something, and then running the knowledge enhancement of the say something. So let's call it student engagement indicator for now. And the other one we really want to pay attention to is to what proportion of students need to be trained in the school to really see the programming differences. So let's call it reach indicator. As you can see, the numbers are representing the percentage of the student being trained in that school. And you'll see it's a wide range from 30% to 100%. So what we did is we look into the difference between two groups. In terms of reach, we break down to two groups, high reach versus low reach. As you can guess, the high reach one are the ones that can train students more than 90%. Majority, most of the students got trained. And the low reach one are the ones that you saw on the table, the lower percentage part. And what we found is there is a difference. The training that can be available to most students can improve self-efficacy, intention, and even trust at school even further compared to those treatment schools did not train students as much. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway, I want to say again, this is preliminary data. So we found no evidence within the 8 schools that we're looking at in Miami-Dade public schools that the Safe Promise Club, at least from this data, we didn't see a difference. Now, this is something we're still wondering, maybe the sample size didn't allow us to detect not large enough effect size. Maybe further research needs to be done to look at what kind of activities matters more than the Safe Promise Club. But this is something we also found. So the Safe Promise Club really did not make a difference in the schools in this setting. Now I'm gonna hand it back to Dr. Justin Heinze for the implementation lesson.
Thanks. And for the last just few minutes of our more didactic part of the presentation, we did just want to talk a little bit about what we heard from those that were working in the treatment schools that were receiving the program. Because if you are familiar with sort of research design, you know that having a sample of 8 to 12 is not going to be representative of everything. But there still is, I think, something to be learned about hearing from people who are directly engaging in the program to guide how we might be moving forward in the future. Next slide. So just off the top, a quote from one of the people responding to our interviews. They're talking about how students are using this program. That's, we're trying to understand the internal validity of this particular this study. Does having the program lead to some of the changes that we would expect it to do? And it seems like, at least from this teacher's perception, by engaging students and talking to them about what does it mean? What does it mean to see something and say something? They do ultimately go and make those reports. Now, what's sort of interesting here is for folks on the call, the anonymous reporting system is thought of, at least by Sandy Hook Promise, as a last resort. They would prefer to have students reach out to a trusted adult or a parent or a teacher or whatever it might be. So that could be a coach, a parent, a teacher, before using this system. The system is here as sort of a fail-safe or a fallback, but knowing that it's there for students and seeing that they're using it is a positive sort of affirmation of at least what we hypothesized would happen. Next slide, please. But it wasn't perfect, and they also gave us some feedback about some of the things that were helpful or not. And I am cognizant that not everybody on this call was working directly in schools, and I think that's going to start to get into where the role of, for example, law enforcement, community partners, and all that kind of stuff might play in a system like that. And it starts with even the team that's going to be implementing and sort of monitoring how the system is working out. So the Sandy Hook model, it has a team of 3 that are appointed at the school. Oftentimes, these are people who are an assistant principal or perhaps a counselor. They may or may not have training in this space. They may or may not have, I can actually guarantee that they're almost always going to have competing responsibilities. And so having more support, and that could also, maybe dovetail with behavioral threat assessment team or other structures that the school might have in place that could also participate in the implementation of the programming. I think that's going to be an important thing as people are moving forward with these systems. Who's going to be responsible for responding? Who's going to be responsible for training? who's going to be responsible for working with the partners that could also be engaging with the system. Next slide, please. But just some themes, again, a smaller sample size, but what we heard from people who are trying to do this on the ground, the ongoing training was critical. So it can't just be a one and done. You go in, you tell us about the system, you tell us about your what it means to see something and say something, and this is when you should report, and this is maybe when you wouldn't need to. But having refresher trainings, having sort of that consistent touch point was important. The multidisciplinary team, again, not everybody on this call works directly in schools, but I bet you have some interaction and engagement with schools. And so thinking about how a team could be responsive to the many different types of tips, as well as the management plans once a tip kind of comes through. If a student is identified as a particular concern, we don't want to just find out or to make sure that that student is safe in the instant. We then have to come up with a way to make sure that student stays safe in the future. So this system can help identify, it can potentially help intervene, but then what are we doing afterwards? Strong support and buy-in, this might be surprising to no one, but I think it does bear repeating because oftentimes, whether we're talking about anonymous reporting systems or we're talking about school climate programs or we're talking about even things like metal detectors or school resource officers, if your school administration is not bought in, doesn't see the value in having whatever intervention, in this case an anonymous reporting system, it's going to trickle down. It's going to be very difficult for those people who are operating on the ground. So making sure that the decision makers, the principals, superintendent, school board are all on board before we expect these systems to do too much. And then the last one, again, seeing through the chat, a lot of people coming from corrections, judicial areas, law enforcement partnerships. And I can't stress that enough because when it comes time to make a decision around what these triage centers are going to do with this information, we need input from all the potential parties who will be engaging. Some tips could be triaged directly to law enforcement. In some other data that we've collected with the Say Something anonymous reporting system, about half were characterized as urgent and needing immediate attention. And again, sometimes those urgent things can be dealt with by the school, sometimes they can be dealt with by a mental health professional, but oftentimes it does involve law enforcement. So making sure that there's a clear line of communication and a clear response approach embedded and ready to go, I think is really critical for these things to be the most effective. And then also for other kind of invested parties, thinking about many of these tips go to parents. And so thinking if you're a parent out there and you get a tip about your child that they might be a danger to themselves or others, or that they might have been using substances or whichever it could be, are those parents then supported in such a way that they can continue to work with their kids? So I do like this idea of interdisciplinary and the way partnerships are forming. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges, some of those barriers. Again, folks working within schools, you see this, like trying to find the time. And we get that safety is a #1 priority. We want our students to be safe in our buildings, but there are also many different ways that we are keeping students safe. And oftentimes these specific school safety strategies are handed to one individual, one champion who's really trying to push a lot of this stuff forward. And some schools have great infrastructure and lots of people that are involved, but we see this time and time again that it's often falling on people who have already a lot on their plate. And so trying to figure out ways to find training, to find those refresher trainings, to make sure that people, if there's a turnover in the building, that everybody is aware of what the system is, how it can be effective. Same thing with students. If you are in middle school and every 2 years you have a completely new building, how are you continuing to make sure that students understand what the system is and how to use it? Next slide, please. And so this sort of segues into our last slide here, which is around anonymous reporting systems. I think are an exciting and potentially very beneficial approach to identifying concerns early. What I like about this isn't necessarily time of incident, and this isn't post-incident. This is not recovery. This is a borderline preventive. And if not, it's at the very front end of time of incidents. We're trying to identify concerns as they're happening or well in advance. This gives first responders more time to engage with the individuals who might be at risk and to try to create a situation where things can be resolved. So it can be a place to intervene when there's escalation, a small fight that could escalate into something that manifests in the neighborhood. This could be somebody who is just starting to show signs of anxiety or depression, but then might start having suicidal thoughts or ideation and then ultimately develop a plan. Right, so where we can intervene in that sort of prevention timeline is really critical. And I think anonymous reporting systems are part of that. But again, that's going to be, they're going to be the most effective when we pair it with what we call a comprehensive school safety approach, which involves things that are focused on the social environment. So trying to develop relationships with teachers and students, trying to create civic-minded students, trying to create ways to resolve differences and conflicts, so with restorative practices or whatever it might be. The attentive environment is where I sort of see ARS fitting in. This is the ability for schools to recognize concerns and intervene appropriately. So anonymous reporting systems are one example. Mental health first aid would be another example. Behavioral threat assessment and management would be an example. So these are really designed to try to recognize concerns and figure out a way to mitigate those concerns. And then lastly is the physical environment. This would be our physical plant, your fences, your windows, your door lock policies, security cameras. I think of security professionals within this sort of physical environment, so making sure that lines of sight are clear and that there are pathways for students to use, that there are adults in key areas where violence might happen. You want programming across all of those different spaces. That's when I think they can be most effective, and that can in turn have influences on both students' physical safety, but also I think their psychological safety. A lot of students that we talk to have concerns about going to school or what might happen at school. And so knowing that these systems are in place, knowing that there are ways that the adults in the building are looking out for their safety can make a big difference in terms of how they can then engage with their learning, which is what we want them to do. And that's what that far right side of the model is that if we can create these safe environments for youth, they are going to be able to actualize as learners like the way we want them to, right? Grow into the best learners they can be. And so this is how we've been thinking about school safety now for a few years. It's one of the things that we see when schools that are performing really well in terms of having lower incidents of violence or less bullying or whatever it might be. It's never like we just do this one thing. It's always, here's a couple of different things that we're doing that work for us. And that's also, I think, important to remember, is that every school is going to be different. And so when we're working with schools, we're trying to figure out what's the combination of programming that works for you and how can we help you implement those things. And I think with that, we are very happy to take any questions about anonymous reporting systems, school safety more generally. But thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Right. Thank you both so much for the presentation. We do have some really excellent questions coming in through the Q&A, but we invite our attendees to put all of the questions that you may have. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll share them afterwards with Hsing-Fang and Justin. All right. So one of the questions that we have is we've heard that a major challenge for school districts about the topic of engaging students and developing trust with students and with families. We're curious, was this evident in your study? And if so, were there effective strategies that mitigated this challenge of developing that trust with the students, their families, and school personnel? Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I'm happy to take on to that. So I think a key thing for us to think about is that trust it doesn't happen just all of a sudden. So really is the long-term goal we want to achieve that trust. So as the first step is really to engage students, teachers, and the whole school community, the parents, into how, okay, this is something we want to think about implementing. Is there a way we figure out a strategy that works specifically for this school community we're in together? So just be open-minded and curious, and then learn from the student community. What I think is one thing to start with.
And I will add that part of this, what we didn't mention here, part of the suite of the Say Something Anonymous reporting system is another program called Start With Hello. It is a Sandy Hook Promise developed program that's designed to build inclusiveness. So essentially, like the message says, you're going into a cafeteria, you see somebody sitting all by themselves, you invite them over to the table, or you're walking in the hallway, you say, hi, Mr. Johnson, hi, Mrs. Smith, whatever it might be. So that you're developing these lines of communication, right? For adults in the building, it's expressing interest in the students that are walking into your hallway, right? It's trying to understand where they're coming from, what's on their mind. so that they feel like that trust is starting to get created. It's treating them like adults. So having students participate in some of the school decision making. So empowering youth to understand, why are we doing this programming, and how would you help us get these messages out there, right? So these are all sort of, little strategies that schools we've seen in different places, trying to create and foster these environments where it's not, no, we're teachers, you're students, you listen and tell us, we're going to tell you what's going on, but it becomes more interactional and more respectful, I think.
Yeah, more like participatory even. And that's interesting, the way that you describe that of like treating the students like adults. You had specifically said that this was in middle schools. And so I'm curious if there were any, like, what were the year ranges for middle school? Because those can range quite differently across different districts. Was it like 5th through 8th, 6th through 8th?
So this program, yeah, go ahead, Justin.
No, please.
Oh, I think we have multiple studies, if I recall, Justin, but this specific one in Miami, we recruited 6th graders to go through the training with us and test the difference.
And to tag on to that point, because I think it's really important. And again, many times these systems are implemented broadly. So the state of Florida actually has Fortify Florida. It's an anonymous reporting system that happened to overlap with the program that we were evaluating. But this would be available ostensibly to any student. And so is the type of engagement and messaging that we're talking about going to look different for somebody who's in 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade versus somebody who's in 6th, 7th, or 8th, or somebody that's in high school? Who can we reasonably expect to use these systems, and in what cases? Do they need to have a cell phone? In the state of Michigan, our OK Data app is on every single one of our devices that are in my children's school district, right? So it comes preloaded so that you can use it and you can see kind of messaging all throughout the district, right? So it's going to be, again, a district by district decision around how are you getting this information out there. And I think for all of us who are interested in positive youth development, it's thinking and trying to create guidance around developmentally, when are students ready to be talking about these things, and what types of things could we reasonably expect?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that it would be different approaches for those different age ranges. A different question that we had is about this topic of buy-in. We had a couple different topics of buy-in, questions about buy-in. How do you establish and maintain buy-in from administrative staff and teachers during the implementation phases? So before we see any type of positive impacts, like how are you building that momentum perhaps for this type of program, and maintaining that, I think, is the more interesting part of this question. Trickier part of the question.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge when you be trying to work in a school setting, given that there are already so much different responsibilities coming for teachers and admin. So I think one big lesson we learn when we're trying to implement it is that we know we have to work around their schedule. We know there are test schedules that is very important for schools to follow. And the teachers and admin, that's one of their many priorities on top of what we're trying to implement here. So really work around their schedule, really start the conversation early. We use the summer to do the planning. We try to see in the beginning of the semester when it's calmer, it's more likely for them to do these kind of additional stuff. And again, like for us, we also care about when we can go into and ask student questions and talk to teachers. So that comes in later. So part of it is also, we want to be able to give back to schools too. So when we are engaging in conversation with schools, we do ask, well, if there is anything we could do, given the data we're able to obtain from the student and the school, is there anything analysis-wise or sharing findings back-wise for your school? If you find it beneficial, that's where we could do something to help.
Anything to add there, Justin? Creating and maintaining buy-in.
I mean, I think actually from just a little bit of different angle, there's at least Sandy Hook in their particular model and approach. They also have, I think they call it Say Something Week. So it's a national event where they're trying to get people to understand what the system is and why it's important to speak out, even if you're not potentially using the system, but particularly towards those districts or states or whichever that are under the auspices. So it's trying to just keep this on people's radar. And making sure that folks know that this is an alternative if they were ever to need it.
And would that Say Something Week be when like some Save Promise Club activities would be going on? Like, is there integration across those?
Yeah.
And broadening
Yes.
out that question a little bit, what are some of the activities that these student involvement clubs are doing in the sample that you have of the, I think, 4 schools that had the clubs?
Yes, 4 schools were engaging in student-led clubs. That's called Safe Promise Club. And there are also school-wide campaign. They disseminate materials, posters, flyers to schools. And I think they nominate a school champion in each school to lead these activities. So those are the key components that we're aware of.
And you had said that there's not a whole lot of evidence yet about that type of thing towards the outcomes of improving school climate, reducing school violence. But with it being the 4, I noticed on your graph that there were 2 that had very small reach. And so I'm getting into a little bit of the nerdy space about that, but I think that it's such a really cool program. And I'm curious if you had the chance to chat with students, if there were any additional insights or thoughts that they had about enhancing school safety outside of and beyond anonymous reporting systems.
Yeah, and so I think it's really important to note on one thing. When students report these warning signs or things that concern them, they really need to know the schools care about it and how they respond to it. So that is part of the building trust. That is part how students can feel, they're safe to report these things, and when they do report, things are being addressed. So that's oftentimes what we keep hearing from students, or even students we work with at graduate schools, that's something we move forward would like to learn more about, how schools actually respond to these reports and how they're solving different issues.
With this, there is a question that came through in the Q&A, and Justin, I see that you typed out an answer, but I want to ask it verbally here. So the question was, did you collect the types of reports that were made? We have another question about like if there were false reports. I think the kinds of questions are getting at triaging the level of importance of these reports that are being made. Sometimes they might be about dangerous situations, but other times the person asks about Snapchat drama and other like things that feel important to teenagers because of where they are developmentally, but may not actually rise to the level of, okay, we need to address this because it's an emergent issue. And so I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to what types of reports were collected and kind of a little bit more about what that triage system looks like. And if there were concerns about false reports or concerns about the misuse of the tools more broadly.
Yeah, so I'm sure Justin can chime in more on that. Let me just start with the data we collect from Miami. I think those common tip categories include actually students reporting depression, anxiety, bullying, self-harm, concern of suicide or suicide ideation, and drug use and distribution too. So it's also beyond what we think, just violent threats.
Yeah, and there are, I mean, I think any system is going to be different, although we're starting to see a little bit of a pattern. If I look at the states of Nevada and Colorado and then State of Hooks provinces system, I mean, you have these triage centers where you are training individuals to respond. So what's interesting, if you have a system like in the state of Michigan, okay to say, it is a confidential reporting system. So in order to use this system, you are to supply your information. And what I think is helpful and why I bring that up is they were able to sort of determine the number of fraudulent or false tips. And the number is actually quite low. So it's hard to know with anonymous reporting systems exactly like, is everything really credible? And if you actually see some of these tips, sometimes it's just, Jenny, I'm really worried about Jenny. And that's essentially what it is. Or I'm really worried about Jenny. She might hurt herself. And you don't get much more information than that. And so part of why having a triage center is important, whether you're talking on the phone or doing having text, and having trained counselors or mental health professionals or response professionals employed there, is so that you can try to coax out some of that information, get a little bit more detail so that you can make the appropriate decision. Because we don't necessarily need to have law enforcement respond to a concern about a fallout that somebody might have had with their friends and they're having a very strong reaction. But at the same time, we don't want to underreact to what could be a very legitimate concern. And so trying to get all those pieces of information, so creating avenues, and to Hsing-Fang's point, I think is really, really important. I think one of the worst things this system could do is have a very long period of resolution. So a tip comes in, and students are seeing that it's not being taken seriously. Nobody's really doing anything about it. And so one of the things that we flag for when we look in this data are, is this a repeated concern? Is this something that somebody has already said in a different context? I told my teacher, but they didn't do anything, so I'm now telling you. Or I reported this already, and how come? Mercifully or thankfully, that hasn't happened a lot in terms of I used this system and nothing happened. But we do see situations where they told somebody in person, nothing seems to be getting done, and so now we're using the system. But I think just like in that sort of that procedural justice idea, right? We expect these systems to then operate and do what we're trying to raise the concern about. And so I think schools need to be committed to make sure that, we have a timeline for when we're going to respond, how we're going to respond, and then a feedback loop, if possible, about, we've heard that there's been some bullying that's happening online. And so we're going to send out a message to our student body to say, remember that we are good digital citizens as, our school community, and trying to address it that way, in addition to addressing the specific concern, like it was this person or whatever it might be. I think the other piece that I'm going to bring up now, and again, seeing some of the audience who completed the poll, is around data sharing and privacy. So this is tricky in terms of we want to be able to get this information in the hands of people that need this information. And so how do these systems, I should say, how are they going to take sensitive information and share it with those people who most need it? And sometimes those people who could still benefit from that information might be a step or two removed from the initial response. And so how do we make sure that somebody, if we have heard a tip about them, they've been in some fights recently, or they're concerned that they might hurt themselves, again, how are we developing that plan? How are the people that might be engaged in that plan looped into those conversations in a way that respects the student's privacy, that respects the tippie's privacy? And once again, because these are so new, because they are still becoming, we're still trying to figure out best practices. A lot of these questions are open, and there's decisions. They're not so straightforward.
Yeah, and that seems really important for the students' psychological safety part of your model, because they need to know that they've been heard, but they also need to know that they are protected, that they are safe, and they are not going to be, I think that you had said earlier in the presentation, a snitch, and that their reputation may not suffer for the fact that they've used this. And I think that it's important to recognize that these things that may not be a big deal to us as adults still mean things to these youth, to the kids who are experiencing them. It is important to them, and the fact that they are outreaching is something that we want them to do. Again, to your point of efficacy, it was very interesting that you were pointing out that efficacy and intent decrease over time, over the course of students' involvement in the school system. Yeah, so there are many questions. One that we wanted to ask is about kind of feelings of safety afterwards. So when you were measuring those school safety outcomes, like the reductions in school violence, were they perceptual differences in terms of feeling safer? Were they more tangible outcomes of there were X fewer fights in the school? If you could speak a little bit about what your outcome measures about school violence were, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and so that's such a wonderful question. I think we had a long debate. You know what might be the best source of collecting school safety data, right? And I think the best approach is probably to consider different sources. And for the findings we're sharing here is really from the students' report. And there are pros and cons about it, I think, in my opinion. So the pros is that the students' report is probably relatively objective, and so that they're reporting how they see their experience at school. This survey is also anonymous, so I think there's to some extent less bias that can introduce from that. The con is that it's, like you said, perceptional, it's observational. There could be events that they are not aware of that's existing in the school administration data that didn't reflect in the survey. So there's that. I think at some point, Justin, maybe you could chime in. We did consider like gathering the student school administrative data for that. Then the downside is that how do we come, like you point out, Dr. May, there are things not reported or not happened. It could be underestimated too with the school administrative data. So there's that. So great points. Like there's certainly different data sources we could consider.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, funnily enough, and we don't have a polled question to ask the folks on the call here, but what would be a sign to you that the tip system is working? Would you want to see more tips, or would you want to see fewer tips? All right, we haven't answered that question. I mean, because you can see the implications between the two choices. More tips is great. They're doing what we hope they do, but that's also indicative of potentially more concern, more violence happening, more self-directed violence happening, whichever it could be. Fewer tips could be indicative of, oh no, we've created this safe environment and students are doing really well, or it could be they're simply not using reporting. So trying to understand even sort of that baseline level of what does violence look like across schools? What would we expect it to be, and how often would that turn into tip behavior? As we start to collect more and more data from more and more of these systems, we're getting a little bit of an understanding of about what rate students are using these systems relative to their population. But we've seen across the states that we have data, I think we have data around now, 16 states have provided some of their data from 2022. There's marked variability. Some have thousands of tips a year, some less than 500, right? And some districts are gonna have many tips, some are gonna have zero. So it's hard to attribute violence or no violence or whichever way, safety or not safety, based on just those tip numbers alone.
Yeah, I have like two things that just spurred in my brain, and we are running a little low on time here. The first was, I'm curious if there are like tip super users, like if there are students who are more so generating these tips. It might not be something that we're able to determine, given that there are anonymous reporting systems, that there are confidential reporting systems, that different districts may have different identifiability of who is providing the tips. So that's, I'm sure, an open question. But a question that might be more answerable from the two of you is one about kind of school demographics. If there's a difference between rural versus urban schools, schools that have higher income versus lower income, other types of demographic elements that make up the student body and the or the school population more broadly, if that has any impact on the use of the efficacy of tip lines, if there's anything that you can say about that, and that will likely be our last question here.
I can take that one, Hsing-Fang. So we actually do have an ongoing study funded by the CDC to look at tips in the statewide reporting system. And we're going to try to drill down to see whether there are differences in the number of tips that are reported by district characteristics. I don't have that data yet for you, but it still has that same sort of challenge or question. Like, do we want to see more tips? Just if it's a better resource school, would we therefore expect more tips because maybe the advertising is better? So I think what's really then critical is, can we monitor implementation at all? How well is this system actually being advertised to students? How much are schools talking to their students about using these systems? Because that could go a long way in manifesting in terms of the actual number of tips that we see. But I think both of those, those factors I think are important to us. We're interested to know what sort of tips or what sort of demographic features of students. Do we see differences by race, sexual orientation, gender identity? Are tips being utilized either by those individuals or about those individuals at different rates, just so again we can understand how students think about these systems and when to use them.
Hsing-Fang, anything that you wanted to add in on that?
No, this is wonderful thoughts from Justin.
All right. Well, great. Thank you both so much on behalf of YJI and everybody else in attendance with us today for sharing your important research. Before I get to closing announcements, I want to pass it back to you for some closing thoughts.
So again, I noticed that when we did this poll that a lot of folks don't necessarily work directly within schools. I could imagine, and I would wonder if you would feel there'd be any utility, a system that goes beyond just focusing on schools, a community-based reporting system. Because oftentimes we see that there's this transference of violence from a community into schools or schools into communities. And so how would somebody who sees a concern in a neighborhood or at a church or wherever it might be make a report like this that doesn't necessarily have to go to the police, it doesn't necessarily have to go to a mental health responder? Could we see utility for systems like this for settings beyond schools? Because the initial evidence that I'm finding or that we're finding across these different studies is that students do use these systems. And there's anecdotal evidence at the very least, as well as some additional data evidence that these systems are making a difference. Police officers are able to respond. Students that were in crisis were helped. Concerns were being raised to schools. So these systems seem to be doing their intended use and even beyond. And I wonder then, are there opportunities beyond just school settings? And so something maybe to ponder on as folks are thinking about your particular professions and how you're engaging with your communities.
Thank you, Justin. Hsing-Fang, anything from you?
Yes, and I would just want to add on this point about youth justice, right? You brought up a good question about the school community is, it's important to consider how this kind of system is recepted and put in practice with the mind of justice and equity. So this program will not work if it's only being successful for certain student community, but not the other. And so one of the work we've been doing, ongoing work, is to really see how this is received and can be improved for different student community. And so that hopefully the goal is that it's a useful tool for everybody.
Great. Thank you so much for those final thoughts from both of you. In a moment here, we're going to launch a poll question to our attendees, asking how much you agree or disagree with the statements, "This webinar was informative," and "This webinar was engaging." We ask you to answer these questions so we know how today's webinar went for you. And while everybody's answering that question, I have a few announcements and items to put on folks' radars. Immediately following this webinar, a survey should appear in the browser window you used to join today's webinar. Please complete the survey as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information is used to improve future webinar sessions and should take no longer than 5 minutes. We're also going to drop the link to the survey in the chat now. If you have not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. The links to these accounts can be found on our website, also linked in chat here. A reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Our next Lunch and Learn webinar is going to be on Tuesday, February 11th at noon Eastern. Dr. Julie Cedarbaum from the University of South California will be joining us for an engaging discussion going beyond adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, to talk about protective and compensatory experiences, or PACEs, that build resiliency and protect against risks. More information to come, but the registration is in the chat now. In closing, I want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. We hope that you've gained something from today's webinar and that you continue to think about the challenges that Dr. Hsieh and Dr. Heinze presented today. We look forward to seeing you at future YJI events.
Thank you for having us.